Welcome again. This is Tips for the Transition, part 3 of our conversation with Christy Demetrakis. She's a speaker and an author of 2 fabulous books called Faith to Conquer Fear. I'm your host, Maria Tomas Keegan. Thanks so much for joining us again, Christy, to continue our conversation about conquering fear. I'm glad we're not talking about fear itself. We're talking about conquering fear. So I know I'm not the only woman interested in this topic. Many of my clients who are going through major life shifts like a divorce or loss of a loved one or a major career change, we face fear head on. Fear of the unknown is a big one for my clients. In our first 2 chats, you shared your story about how you came to face fear yourself and understand that there is an art to conquering fear. The word art, I'll remind everyone, is an acronym, and you told us about the A standing for acknowledging. The next step is represented by the R, which stands for root cause. Please tell us, Christy, I can't wait to hear this. Once we've acknowledged we have fear, how do we determine the source or the root cause of those fears?
Excellent question. In chapter 2 of my book, the title of that chapter is actually the exploration phase, right? So you're thinking about the journey. So this is your point of exploration. And there's 3 questions I ask people to consider. The first one is, what's the history of your fear? Is this a fear that you've had your entire life? Or is this some new fear that you have? Because what you'll often find if you really start to take a step back and seek out the root causes of those fears is some fears are not from your own personal experiences. Mm-hmm. Some are fears that are put on you by someone else. I remember growing up, my mom, I had 2 twin cousins that lived right next to me. We were literally a month apart in age. And we used to always, those days we're out in the yard all the time. We didn't have all the Xboxes and all the video games. We were always out in the yard playing, and we would do our cartwheels and do all these things. And I always wanted to flip backwards like the gymnast did. And every time I went to attempt that, my mom would say, "Don't do that. You're going to break your neck. You're going to break your neck." And at some point I stopped trying because of that fear that she had instilled in me that I would break my neck if I did that. And I still look at gymnasts to this day and I'm just in awe, probably because I never tried it myself for fear that I would break my neck. But that's some fears are just put on you by other people. So that's a good question to ask yourself is what is the history of this fear that I have? Okay. The other one is, what triggers your fear? There are situations and circumstances that bring those fears to life. And in many cases, we don't ever even necessarily realize we had the fear. And a great example of that is people who get up to do public speaking for the first time. I train people to become, great presenters, dynamic presenters. But sometimes people don't realize that they have a fear of public speaking until somebody says, "Hey, can you get up and do the announcements?" Or, "Hey, can you get up and be in this play?" And all of a sudden you go, So, and that's a dramatic example, but sometimes those fears just kind of reveal themselves. Another one is, how does that fear affect you? So it's one thing to have a fear, but it's another one to let that fear dictate your behaviors. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you another personal example that I share. When I wrote my first book, Faith to Conquer Fear, the Inspiration to Achieve Your Dreams, God had also given me a vision for creating and hosting a workshop or a conference around this particular book. And for 2 years, I ignored it. I heard it. I heard him say it. I heard him say it again multiple times. And I went, yeah, we'll get around to it. Don't really want to do that. And I couldn't really understand why I didn't want to do it, because at this point I had a ton of corporate background. I had been in sales. I had done marketing. I've done all these things. So there's no legitimate reason as to why I was hesitating to do this conference. And I ended up having a phone conversation or a Skype conversation with a woman from Australia that I met on LinkedIn. And she and I were just getting to know each other one Saturday morning, and we're asking about each other's goals and aspirations and what we're working on. And I told her I had this vision for hosting a conference. And she said, "Well, why haven't you done it yet?" And I said, "That's an excellent question." Yeah. So while we were on the phone on this Skype call, she said, "Well, if you were to do this conference," she was a perfect psychologist. "If you were to do this conference, what would it look like?" And in minutes, I had laid it all out. I had my agenda, what time the breaks were, who my keynote speakers would be, all these things I had it perfectly laid out. She said, well, great. I'm going to be in the States in April, and I'm happy to be one of your speakers. Let's do it. And I immediately broke out into this sweat because at this point it was December. So this was 4 months away. I'm thinking, oh my, what? Like a whole, like do this thing? And so I did. And that was my first conference. But here was the thing. The whole time I'm planning this conference, I was absolutely terrified. And I was terrified, and I didn't know why I was terrified, because again, I knew how to market an event. I knew how to, get the caterers. I knew how to do all the logistics to get people to an event, but yet I was still fearful. So about 2 months in, I'm driving down the highway, and God brings this memory of my 16th birthday party back to my mind. And I remember that my brother-in-law's sister and I, we were the same age. Our birthdays were 2 days apart. And so we decided to host our 16th birthday party together. Well, the night of the party, all of her friends showed up, and only one person that I invited showed up. Only one person. Now, I think about that and I go, I should just burst into tears every time, because clearly I needed a new set of friends. but when I thought about that, I said, and I had not thought about that in 30 years. I had not thought about that in 30 years. But what that told me was, it was that fear of rejection that I was dealing with and that had been in me for 30 years. And so I was afraid to host this conference because I was afraid that nobody would come, because in my mind, the things that were important to me were not going to be important enough for other people to attend. And that was the barrier. That is why I had put that off for 2 years. Now, I did that conference for another 3 years, and which was great. But every time I did it, I still had that same fear, right? But the important part is I did it afraid. And that's the key.
Wow. Wow. That's a powerful story. I thank you so much for sharing that. I can think of a number of people I know, myself included, who have had very similar fears of, putting yourself out there for, a workshop or an event of some kind, and no one showing up, or just one person showing up. I'm not sure which is worse. If no one shows up, you can cancel it and go home. But if just one person shows up, thank you for sharing. I love poking around to find root causes, as painful as it can be, because it's a powerful way to understand if the beliefs we held back at the time the root cause happened, whether they're still true for us today. So folks, please stay tuned for the continuation of this chat with Christy when she continues to unwrap her steps in the art of conquering fear, because next she's going to explain what the T represents. Thanks again, Christy. I can't wait for that. And while you're all waiting for that to air, Christy, again, has generously offered you an opportunity to read chapter 1 of her second book, Faith to Conquer Fear, The Journey. And I know you're going to love it as much as I have loved reading it. So to request it, take note of the link at the bottom of the screen, or click on it in the description at the bottom of the video. Thanks so much for joining us today. And remember, we are not created to live in fear. So focus on standing in your own power, having a spirit of love, and using your good judgment. Till next time.